But my first assignment was to cover a flower show in Piedmont. And I went to cover the flower show and wrote 4,000 words and turned it into Mr. Crowley, who was my senior correspondent in the Oakland, for the San Francisco Examiner in the Oakland press room. And Crowley looked at me and he read the copy, and then he said to me, "These are the most beautiful 4,000 words I have ever read." It was more than I could do not to cry. But do me a favor and see if you, it's a little long, he said, for the paper, see if you can cut it in half. And so, with great anguish, I went and cut it in half. And Crowley read it again, and this time even more sentimental. Crowley was Irish, was always wearing a hat. And he said, "Once again, I have wept, but do me a favor and cut it in half again." And we went through this routine until it finally got down to one paragraph in the Sunday paper. And that was my introduction to learning how to edit and also how to write for the newspaper. I spent 3 years in San Francisco and learned how to write shorter sentences, and then came to New York with the New York Herald Tribune, which in 1960, 61, 62 was a truly marvelous newspaper. It put a lot of emphasis on the ability to write. Among the other people on the staff at the same time were Charles Portis, Tom Wolfe, Jimmy Breslin, and it was a lot of fun. But after a while, after a couple of years, I thought I wanted to write at longer length. Newspaper story is 500, 700 words, and I wanted to write 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words. It was the era of the new journalism in the middle 60s in New York. So I became a contract writer for the Saturday Evening Post, which was a wonderful education. I had 6 years at the Post and would travel around the world, really, to write pieces about the America's Cup, about the Beatles in India, and about President Johnson in Washington. And the Post in those days, the transition that's going on in the 60s is the move from print to television. In 1960, the Post, Life magazine were the main instruments of the big media. And if the President of the United States wanted to talk to the American people, he would sit for an interview with Joseph Alsop on the back page of the Post, or with Teddy White on the back page of Life magazine. And of course, by 1970, that had all changed. And if the President wanted to talk to the American people, he would sit down and talk to one of the television people on Meet the Press or Face the Nation. So, but in the middle of the 60s, while the long form in the big magazines was still a plausible form, I traveled. The pieces would be, you'd go somewhere for 3 months or 4 months and take a lot of notes, and then come back and try to turn it into an intelligent narrative. And among the other people at the Post at that same time were both Joan Didion and her husband, John Gregory Dunn, who was, to my mind, one of the best journalists to come out of the 60s. The Post folded. I then went briefly to work for Life magazine, the same kind of deal. Life magazine folded. I then went to Harper's Magazine as a writer, became an editor by accident. It never had occurred to me to become an editor, but there was a Boulevard Small and office politics, and it's a familiar story in New York journalism. And so on a Tuesday I was a writer, and on Wednesday I was the managing editor. And I stayed there ever since. It so happened that was 1971, and I got married and began to have children. And my prior life as a writer had been one where I could travel at will and spend lots of time out of town, and I couldn't do that anymore. So I learned how to become an editor. I learned from Otto Friedrich, who was the editor of the Saturday Evening Post, and then from a man named Jack Fisher, who was a emeritus editor at Harper's Magazine. And everything I know about editing I learned from those two men. Hokusai, when he was 95, or maybe 85, not sure which, but somebody asked him about painting, and he said, when I was 15, I knew I was in love with painting. By the time I was 30, I had begun to learn something about how to do it. When I was 70, I think I understood the first principles. Now I am 85, and by the time I get to be 100, everything I draw, whether it's a dot or a line, will be alive. You who live so long, see if I'm not right. But I have some of the same. I'm still learning how to write. I think my writing is getting better, and certainly I'm learning to edit it more heavily and cut the second adjective, no matter how beautiful it is, and maybe avoid the third Baroque variation on the metaphor. But again, I mean, it's like Casals. Casals was 93, and living in Puerto Rico with a woman who was 45 years younger than himself, and a journalist from New York goes down to interview him and says, "Mr. Casals, you're the most famous cellist in the world, and you're living here in the sun with a woman 45 years younger than yourself. Why do you practice the cello every morning for 4 hours?" And Casals said, "Because I'm learning something." And that's what I am still doing. Ask me any question, and I will have an attempt at an answer.